All right, how's it going? My name is Kamran Zare. I'm a woodshop teacher here at Landrum Middle School in Spring Branch ISD, which is located in Houston, Texas. And what I'm going to do today is we're going to talk about using a router, both a handheld router and also a router table. And so what I'm going to do is actually show you the handheld router first. I'm going to go over the parts and then demonstrate how to use it and explain that process. And then I'm going to go to a router table and also talk about those parts and demonstrate how to use it as well. And we're going to use two different router tables because I have two different bits set up in them, so we can see two different possibilities that my students might end up taking a look at whenever they use the router themselves. So let's just start with the handheld router, and I'm going to demonstrate all the parts, or tell you all the parts. So first of all, a router comes in two basic parts. This entire thing is the base. And so this right here is really the base of the base, okay, because this is the part that has to sit flat on your workpiece. But this whole thing is called a base. And then we also have these things that I'm holding, which are called knobs or grips, okay? Now, the other part of a router is actually really simple. It's just an electric motor. But this electric motor is able to receive a router bit. So what you see here is a straight cutting fluted bit, okay? And what holds it in is this collet right here, okay? So this kind of just tightens down and it clamps onto that router bit so it doesn't come out. But this is a router motor, and this one's real simple. It's not a variable speed, so it's either on or off, okay? And I'm going to make sure it's in the off position because I don't want to be having a surprise whenever I plug it in. So the basic parts of the handheld router that you need to know is base, knob or grip, router bit, power switch, and that's pretty much all you've got to know. Now, in order to use the router, before we use any machine, we've got to make sure that we take care of a couple personal safety items. Number one being, put on your safety glasses. Number two, make sure you tie your hair back so it doesn't get in the way, it doesn't get in the way of your vision. And number three is we've got to make sure we take off any jewelry that's dangling that might get hung up in a machine, necklaces, lanyards, dangling earrings, rings, watches, bracelets, things like that. We also got to make sure that if we have any long clothing that's baggy, we either remove it or we tuck it in to get it away from the machine so it doesn't get hung up in anything. And then we also have to make sure that we take off any jackets or sweaters so we can see from the tips of our fingers to our elbows so nothing gets hung up in the machine. Now, after we take care of those safety items, the very next step is we need to have some sort of plan. Now, my plan is that I'm going to use this handheld router to do something that my students really like to do, which is carve into a piece of wood. And typically, they would have a pattern or they would have something pre-drawn that they want to carve in, and it's basically a lot of just freehand motion to carve it in, okay? But I don't have anything like that, but I do have a pencil, and what I'm going to do, because my name is Mr. Zare, I'm just going to carve in a Z shape, right? So I've drawn in my Z. Now that I have a plan, I'm going to get to a table that's clear, that nobody's sitting around, or if people that are sitting around it, if they have their safety glasses on, we're good. And I'm going to take my piece of wood, and I need to place it on something that is not going to allow the wood to slide around. So, just flat on the table, it's easy to move around, there's not enough friction, so I'm going to use these things, which are called bench cookies. They have rubber on both sides, and they elevate the piece of wood. Also, at the same time, they prevent it from moving really easily. So once I have my piece of wood secure, and we know it's not going to move around real easily, I'm ready to go take a look at the router. So, before I do anything, I want to adjust my router base so that my router bit is poking out from the base the right amount. Typically, this is something me as a teacher I'm going to do for you, but it's actually really simple. We have this little buckle here. If I loosen this and I turn my base, I can see that as I turn it, the more I turn it, the more the bit sticks out. and then I can also bring the bit back in by turning it in the opposite direction. So I'm going to basically put this to where it's sticking out maybe a 1/16 of an inch, just so we can get a good idea of what's going on, and I'm going to lock it in place. Once I've done that, I can no longer set my router on the base because I've got the bit sticking out and might damage the bit. So I'm going to have to place it on its side on the table. Once I've gotten that taken care of, I'm going to examine it to make sure it's in the off position. So this toggle switch is in the off position, so I know it's off, so when I plug it in, it doesn't spin off the table. Then, because it's a plug-in machine, I'm going to inspect the cable to make sure everything looks good. Everything looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and plug it in. Now, before I use the router, I've got to think about which direction am I going to travel. Because I'm going to use this bit to carve, it's not so super important that I'm traveling in a certain direction, because it's making a small hole that basically is going to travel around, and so I'm not going to get a lot of resistance from it. But one of the things that a router also does is we can change the edge of a piece of material, which I'm going to show you that in just a little bit. In the case of using a handheld router to change the edge of a piece of material, there's a certain direction that you can only travel in safely, and that is counterclockwise around the perimeter of a piece of material. So if you're not sure how to figure out what's counterclockwise, if you take your right hand, this does not work with your left, but if you take your right hand and you turn it into, like a play gun, right? Take your right hand and place your thumb against the piece of material that you plan on changing the edge of. Your thumb is placed against that. Your pointer finger will point in the direction that it needs to travel around the piece of wood. So that means this would be counterclockwise. Of course, I'm not doing this because I'm not working around the outside. So instead, all I'm going to do is drop myself into this Z, and then I'm simply going to try to follow the line the best that I can. Now, when we do this, we are going to be looking through this little window here in the base. I've got to pay close attention to where that bit is in relationship to the line that I've drawn. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this up, and typically I like to have this cable kind of over my right shoulder, up and out of the way. I do not want the cable to get anywhere close to the router bit, and I'm going to crouch down to where I'm close to this table, right, so I can see really well. Once I turn this thing on, my goal is to set it flat into the piece of material. Once it's flat, it's fully engaged in cutting, and then I'm just simply going to move this as best I can to follow the line pattern that I've drawn in. So this is going to get loud, so I'm not going to do much explaining as I'm going, and if I do, you may not be able to hear me anyway. So I think I'm ready. I'm going to go ahead and turn the machine on. I'm going to slowly bring it down to the line. Now it's in. So I'm going to follow my line the best that I can. When I'm done, I'm going to pick it straight up, turn it this way, turn the machine off. As it is slowly winding down, I'm going to lay it on its side, and we can see that here, even though it's got a lot of fuzzies, I've carved in a Z shape into my piece of material. When I'm done with the router, the handheld router, I'm going to come over, unplug it. Once I've unplugged it, I'm going to unbuckle it so I can spin the base down, and then I'm going to wrap it up and put it back in the tool room where it belongs. Also, this tends to make a lot of mess. So what I would need to do is clean off the table, brush everything onto the floor, and then sweep it up into the dust collector. Now, that is one part of 3 parts that I'm going to discuss here. So this is just using the handheld router. Next up, I'm going to show you how to use the router table using a fence. All right, now we're at part 2, where we're going to use this router table that's attached to this Powermatic table saw. And what I'm going to use this for is I want to trim a rabbet into the edge of this piece of wood. Okay? And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to utilize the fence to cut that rabbet into my piece of wood. So, typically, anytime you use the router table, this is not something that I let my students make any adjustments or measurements on. This is something that I, myself as a teacher, am going to make all the adjustments for them, lock everything in place so that we can reproduce this over and over. Now, the only difference between the handheld router and the router table is that all this is a handheld router mounted upside down, and then we can utilize the table, and we can also utilize a fence. So when we take a look at this router table, we have this flat surface, which is our table. We have this part, which is called the table insert. This is how we attach the router to the table. We have this vertical section right here, which is called a fence, just like on all the other machines that have a fence. We have this part right here, which is called a bit guard. It prevents us from really getting down in there and probably touching the bit, and we should not do that. We also have a channel in the middle of the table, which is called a miter slot. This is so we can run a miter gauge through this. And then down here on this particular table, we have our power switch here. I've got another router table that we'll see, and I'll go over those parts, but I won't explain them now. So let me go over the parts again. We've got a power switch, table, miter slot, table insert, fence, bit guard, and right down here, this is going to be our router bit. Okay? Now, there is a specific rule on how you use a router table. You always start your piece of material on the right-hand side of the split fence, and you move from right to left, traveling along the fence. Never the other way around. If you go this way, it's going to try to shoot your piece of material in that direction. We want to go from right to left. So, what I'm going to do is I want to put a rabbet on this edge right here. So, I'm going to turn this face down. I'm going to bring it flat up against the fence. I'm making sure I took care of all of my 5 safety items, so I'm ready to go. Once I have it flat up against the fence, I'm going to simply travel from the right side across to the left side, and we'll see what the result is. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. And now I have a small rabbet right here in the edge of my piece of material. So we want to make sure right to left, keep it flat up against the fence, keep it flat on the table the entire time. When I'm done, what I need to do is make sure that I blow off all this sawdust onto the floor with the air hose, and then of course sweep up my area. Up next, I'm going to show you the other router table using a 1/4 roundover bit without a fence. See you in a bit. Alright, so now we're at part 3, which is a different router table, not connected to anything. This is a Craig router table. And this router table has all the same components except for the power switch is actually the power switch on the router. And so the router is upside down, and I would have to move the toggle switch on the side of the router to turn it on. So we've got a power switch, table, we've got a miter slot, we have our table insert, we have a bit guard and a fence, and we have our router, except you'll notice that the fence is pushed back, and the bit guard is nowhere to assist us at all. And the reason why is sometimes we might need to use a roundover bit or some other type of bit in an irregular shaped or irregular sized piece of material. So this is actually a square, so this is not irregularly shaped. However, we're just going to use this as an example. And what I want to do is I want to round over part of one edge, round the corner, and part of the next edge. Okay? So we're going to go through that process and see the steps that we would take. Okay? So I've got a roundover bit, so what this will do is it'll give me a 1/4 inch radius on my edge. Right? Now, there's nothing here protecting my hands, so I want to keep my hands as far away as possible from this bit. This bit happens to have a bearing. The bearing doesn't do any cutting. So the bearing is going to travel against the edge of the material, and the cutting part is what you should see as red. That's what's going to do all the cutting. So my goal is to bring this material up to the bearing, then it starts cutting, and then I'm going to, again, move from right to left. And as I get to the corner, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot this piece of material around like so, and then continue the process. There is a slot for us to put a pivot point there, but typically, those things sometimes kind of get in the way if you're doing it in a regular shape. So I'm going to go without that. So let me now demonstrate that process. I'm going to scoop down and turn this on. Remember, keep your hands away from this bit. Bring this material from right to left. I'm going to pivot around the corner and continue the process. When I'm done, I'm going to reach down and turn the machine off. And so what you see here is I was able to round that corner without any problem, as long as I was going right to left the entire time, even while I was pivoting. So, my last step, of course, would be to clean up all the mess that I create, take it to the dust collector, and then, of course, unplug this so nobody else can walk over here and turn it on. Hopefully, this gives you enough information to be able to use a handheld router and a router table for some simple tasks, and hopefully for my students, this gives you enough information so you can pass the paper test. Good luck.